Right now, in the deepest privacy of this late hour, your mind might be engaged in a quiet, punishing trial, acting as a hyper-vigilant inspector who is continuously checking the seams of your own character for unseen flaws. You might be lying awake, reviewing an ordinary interaction from your afternoon, scolding your spirit for an awkward phrase, an imperfect reaction, or a perceived lack of emotional grace. There is a profound, systemic weariness that comes from treating yourself as a continuous self-improvement project that never reaches completion, an internal posture where your mind operates like a hostile workspace always under audit. You are constantly trying to sharpen, refine, and optimize your internal state before you allow yourself to simply live, carrying a chronic anxiety that you are fundamentally misaligned or missing a crucial piece of personal evolution. It feels as though your mind has become a narrow, overworked slate-sharpening stone, scrubbed so aggressively against the heavy iron blades of daily life that its surface has worn into a paper-thin, fragile hollow, ready to crack under the slightest pressure. Let the cold, heavy neutrality of the midnight hour absorb the full weight of that relentless internal evaluation. In this unmonitored sanctuary, the competitive world has fully paused its demands, offering an isolated clearing where you are no longer required to optimize your consciousness or track your spiritual progress. Notice the clean, mineral-scented air drifting slowly through your window, carrying the cold, slate-like fragrance of high-altitude rain, wet stone dust from a mountain gorge, and the sharp, grounding crispness of limestone-heavy well water settling in the dark. Your physical frame is entirely supported by the dense, unyielding reality of a low wooden platform wrapped in the heavy, unvibrating grain of a linen-covered mattress, which completely takes the baseline burden of your pelvis, your ribcage, and your skull, without requiring a single ounce of defensive resistance. Outside, the steady, rhythmic drip of water falling from an old cedar eave onto a flat flagstone below creates a slow, hypnotic cadence that drains the hot, analytical static away from the tight networks behind your eyes. Dear friend, right now, please let this soft reassurance settle into the crowded, hyper-corrected spaces of your chest. You are not broken. What you are experiencing as you lie awake, auditing your performance, is not a failure of your mindfulness or a proof that you are spiritually stagnant. The constant impulse to fix your internal state, the habit that tells you to stay armed and watchful against your own imperfections, is not a defect in your soul. It is a highly intelligent, wounded system trying to use self-criticism as a shield against a demanding world. Tonight, we will not try to force your hypercritical thoughts to become perfectly silent, and we will not launch a new campaign to fix your anxiety. Instead, we are going to explore a surprising insight from Buddhist wisdom. The mind does not become peaceful by constantly grinding itself against a sharpening stone. It becomes peaceful when it realizes that its current, unpolished shape was never a mistake to begin with. You do not have to solve the long puzzle of your personal growth tonight, and nothing is required of your corrective energy in this quiet room. When we treat our natural human flaws as a permanent emergency, our spirit behaves exactly like that overworked whetstone, wearing itself down into a jagged, brittle groove through continuous friction. In our desperate panic to prevent ourselves from being judged or found wanting, we keep pressing the blades of our intellect harder against our own awareness, believing that if we just grind the material long enough, we can manufacture a flawless identity. We mistake our chronic self-reproach for a necessary form of discipline, completely blind to the reality that by continuously scrubbing the slate, we are the ones creating the paper-thin vulnerability that leaves us feeling so close to breaking. True inner freedom does not arrive when you finally become a pristine, optimized instrument. It begins when you stop treating your own mind as an object that must be aggressively redesigned before it is allowed to rest. What happens when you stop the friction and simply allow the stone to sit bare, wet, and undisturbed in the shade? If it feels right, take a slow breath in, letting the cold, mineral-rich air expand the restricted spaces beneath your collarbones. And as that breath slips softly back out into the room, invite your lower jaw, your throat, and the tiny muscles around your cheekbones to go completely slack. You are safe enough to soften right here. You do not have to declare yourself perfectly healed, achieve an advanced state of meditation, or eliminate every trace of self-criticism before you are permitted to rest your limbs. We are simply letting the heavy, calculating engine of your self-improvement project sit idle on the floorboards for the night, allowing your nervous system to discover that it can remain deeply anchored without having to maintain a constant audit of its performance. In a moment, this story will show us something even quieter, carrying our awareness away from the modern pressure of self-optimization and placing us inside a high mountain gorge where an old tool mender works with the natural weight of raw stones. We will enter an isolated workshop that operates according to a law that does not demand an immediate sharpness, but allows the slate to remain cold, thick, and non-reactive in the presence of the spring. But before that mountain world opens its doors to your imagination, let your physical body sink fully into the slow, rhythmic cadence of this present interlude. The inhalation is a cool, liquid current that pacifies the heat in your throat. The exhalation is a heavy, wordless surrender that lets your frame dissolve deeper into the bedding. You do not have to earn your right to be unpolished, and you do not have to fix your mind before you are allowed to sleep. Imagine yourself walking along a narrow flagstone path that tracks the winding course of a high green-shadowed mountain river. The air up here is thick, refreshing, and deeply alive, filled with the sharp, clean scent of crushed fern leaves, damp moss, and the resinous musk of ancient hemlocks after a long night of rain. The sky above is a seamless dome of dark granite grey, holding the first quiet murmurs of a cold morning mist that is slowly drifting down from the upper crags to wrap around the trunks of the pines. There are no critical judges standing along this path to evaluate your progress, and there are no scorecards measuring the speed of your alignment. There is only the grounding, heavy texture of the stone beneath your steps, and the steady, distant roar of the river dropping through a series of limestone shelves. With every slow stride you take down into this quiet gorge, you are choosing to drop the heavy, agonizing projects of self-correction that have kept your mind on high alert all day. The cool mountain fog begins to gather between the timber posts of the tool mender's sheds, isolating you completely from the social expectations and personal standards that have made your chest feel like a clenched fist. You are moving toward a sanctuary, where your unpolished nature is not viewed as a spiritual failure, but as the natural, dignified state of an unquarried stone that has no need to be ground down by friction. Near the mouth of a high mineral spring, where a single oil lamp casts a long amber reflection across a trough of dark well water, the open door of an ancient mountain workshop reveals a long cedar bench covered in raw slate blocks. Resting silently in the cool green shadow of the rock wall, the wet, stone-scented chill of the high mountain workshop deepens as your awareness steps completely over the worn cedar threshold, leaving the restless evaluations of your ordinary life behind in the mist. Inside this high-altitude sanctuary, the air feels heavy and dense, cooled by the proximity of the dark limestone walls and saturated with the raw, elemental scents of damp earth, scraped iron filings, and the faint, sulphurous bite of mineral-heavy well water dripping slowly into a deep stone trough. Every corner of the workspace holds the quiet residue of continuous labor piles of unrefined slate blocks, baskets of blunt farm implements, and the fine grey powder of pulverized rock settling over the heavy oak timbers. It is within this cool, subterranean atmosphere that we discover Kenji, a young monk whose spirit has become completely trapped in a relentless cycle of self-auditing and chronic psychological adjustment. Kenji had not come to the mountain looking for wealth or fame. He had come seeking an absolute, pristine purity of mind. Yet, somewhere along the steep paths of his training, his search for inner peace had turned into a severe, unyielding campaign against his own humanity. He treated his ordinary thoughts like dangerous defects, his natural fatigue like a spiritual failure, and every minor lapse in his concentration as an emergency that required immediate aggressive correction. He spent his days watching his breath with a tight, panicky vigilance and his nights reviewing his conduct with a cold, prosecutorial eye, always believing that if he could just grind away his remaining imperfections, he would finally earn the right to feel secure. This habit of constant self-correction had worn his nervous system thin, leaving him hypersensitive, brittle, and deeply exhausted by the weight of his own relentless judgment. At the center of the workshop, illuminated by the flickering amber glow of a single rapeseed oil wick, stood Master Koi, the mountain tool-mender. He was an elder whose shoulders carried the solid, unhurried patience of the hills, his skin toughened by decades of cold spring water and rough iron dust. Beside his workbench rested the unique physical anchor of his craft, a narrow, fine-grained grey slate whetstone mounted in a heavy timber block. This specific sharpening stone had been used so continuously and scrubbed so aggressively over the seasons that its central face was no longer flat. It had been worn down into a deep, jagged, and paper-thin hollow, its middle section so translucent that the dark wood of the mounting block could almost be seen through the remaining rock. Kenji walked toward the bench, his movements stiff with the built-up tension of his anxieties, and picked up a heavy, unpolished iron blade that had been brought up from the valley farms. The steel was dull, nicked by rocks and stained by dark oxidation from the rice fields. Yielding to the frantic command of his conditioning, Kenji dipped his fingers into the cold mineral trough, splashed a handful of water across the worn grey slate, and pressed the iron blade down into the deeply hollowed groove of the stone with all the force of his straining shoulders. He began to grind the metal against the rock with a rhythmic, desperate velocity. The sound that filled the workshop was harsh, a low, metallic scraping that vibrated directly through the timber bench and into the bones of Kenji's wrists. As the steel bit into the slate, a thick, dark grey slurry of stone dust and iron filings began to accumulate beneath the blade, forming a gritty, abrasive paste that covered his fingers and filled the narrow valley of the stone. Kenji did not look at the beauty of the surrounding mountain. His focus was entirely locked onto a microscopic scratch near the tip of the iron blade. In his mind, that tiny irregularity was an unpardonable flaw, a proof that the tool was useless. And he believed that if he did not scrub the metal harder, if he did not use the absolute weight of his body to flatten the surface immediately, the blade would remain permanently ruined. The friction increased, the wet stone slurry splashing against his linen sleeves, the metallic scent of scraped iron rising thick into the cold air. Kenji's breathing became shallow, a rapid, uneven cadence that mirrored the frantic pacing of his latter night thoughts. He could feel the thinness of the slate beneath his hands. He could feel the jagged edges of the hollow stone groaning under his weight, yet his habit of chronic correction would not allow him to pause. He pressed down even harder, his muscles trembling, forcing the metal against the depleted rock in a fierce, blind attempt to manufacture a flawless edge through sheer aggression. What happened next shattered the silent momentum of his striving. With a sharp, echoing clack that resounded through the stone rafters like a small winter frost crack, the thin grey slate whetstone suddenly split clean in two under the unnatural pressure of his hands. The heavy iron blade slipped off the bench, striking the stone floor with a dull, ringing thud, while the thick slurry of wet grey dust spilled out across the oak planks, leaving Kenji's palms bare, raw, and stained with dark grit. The narrow valley of the stone had broken completely open, its fragile, overworked center unable to hold the burden of an anxiety that did not know how to stop grinding. Kenji stood perfectly frozen above the broken fragments, his chest heaving, his mind instantly launching a fierce new wave of self-judgment. He felt a deep, waterlogged shame wash over his shoulders. Believing that he had ruined the master's tools, that he had failed the lesson, and that his clumsiness was a final proof of his spiritual incompetence. He began to stammer an apology, his hands shaking as he reached down to gather the wet, muddy slate dust from the floorboards. "Master," he whispered, his throat tight with a familiar, suffocating restriction. "I am sorry. I was only trying to remove the final scratch from the iron. I wanted to make the edge perfectly straight. If I had been more precise, if I had monitored my weight more carefully, the stone would not have broken. I will clean this mess and find a way to correct my error." Master Jin did not move to replace the stone, and he did not scold the young monk for his frantic behavior. He simply walked to the deep mineral trough, dipped a clean square of unbleached hemp cloth into the limestone-heavy water, and returned to the bench with a slow, deliberate step. He did not reach for a new whetstone, and he did not pick up the iron blade from the floor. He gently took Kenji's grit-stained hands within his own, turned them palms upward, and began to use the damp cloth to wash away the thick slurry of grey slate dust that had dried beneath his fingernails. "Look at the bench," young traveler Master Koi said softly, his voice holding the neutral, unhurried resonance of water dripping in an empty cave. "You believe that the stone broke because you were not precise enough, or because you failed to monitor your movements. But the truth is much simpler. This slate was ruined long before you arrived tonight, because it has been subjected to a continuous, aggressive scrubbing that never allowed its core to rest. You have spent your years treating your own mind like a defective tool that must be ground down by constant self-reproach, believing that your criticism is the only thing keeping your spirit from becoming blunt." The old man dropped the soiled cloth into the wooden bucket, letting the grey mud dissolve into the clear water. "Your constant desire to optimize your behavior is not an act of wisdom," the master murmured, looking directly into the young monk's tired eyes. "It is fear pretending to protect you by keeping your awareness in a permanent state of repair. Tonight, your real discipline is not to clean the bench or fix the broken pieces. Your only work is to sit directly with the unpolished raw iron on the floor, allowing the grinding engine of your intellect to stop its wheels, without deciding that you must bleed to deserve a place in this valley." Kenji sank down onto a low oak block, the fierce, defensive wall of his self-correction beginning to crack open inside his chest. He looked at his wet, clean hands resting empty upon his knees, and in that quiet gap between his judgments, the deep mountain night seemed to rush in to fill the silence, carrying the slow, unhurried wisdom of things that are allowed to remain exactly as they are. The broken halves of that grey slate whetstone, resting silently on the timber workbench, carry an immediate, unvarnished truth directly into the quiet parameters of your own room tonight. As you lie here in the dark, insulated by the deep stillness of this late hour, the image of those fractured pieces and the spilled muddy slurry begins to illuminate the real source of your hidden exhaustion. The sharp, persistent ache of insufficiency that sits directly behind your forehead whenever you try to review your flaws is not a sign that you are failing to grow. It is the natural, inevitable protest of a spirit that has been subjected to a continuous, aggressive scrubbing, forced to act as its own harsh judge under the mistaken belief that constant self-reproach is the only path to safety. When we look through the clear, compassionate lens of Buddhist insight, we discover that this ancient story is not an invitation to stop feeling, Nor is it asking us to become cold, indifferent, or completely detached from our personal development. It is not suggesting that you should abandon your integrity or become careless with your actions. Rather, it is showing us something quieter, a much gentler way of relating to your own sensitive consciousness. One of the deepest realizations of the Buddha was that our greatest psychological suffering does not reside within our natural imperfections or the ordinary awkwardness of our human reactions. The torment is born entirely from the way the calculating mind holds those imperfections, treating every minor shadow in your thoughts as a dangerous defect that must be violently ground down before the dawn. In the timeless terrain of emotional healing, what we often refer to as attachment is not a complex philosophical theory. It is simply the tight, panicky bracing of an intellect that demands absolute perfection from itself before it allows the body to draw a peaceful breath. It is the internal voice that looks at an ordinary day and secretly declares, "I must monitor every feeling, I must correct every trace of anxiety, and I must force my mind into a flawless idealized shape before I am allowed to feel worthy." We turn our chronic self-criticism into a necessary rule of discipline, completely blind to the reality that by continuously pressing our awareness against the sharpening stone, we are the ones generating the paper-thin vulnerability that leaves us feeling so close to breaking. And this is where the mind begins to soften. Buddhist wisdom helps us understand that the suffering was not only in what happened or in the flaws you carry, but in the way the mind handles those realities. To see this clearly, we have to recognize that your current midnight exhaustion is divided into two entirely separate dimensions, the first pain and the second pain. The first pain is simply the raw, unpolished reality of what life brings to your door, the natural presence of a human error, a transient wave of anxiety, an awkward social interaction, or the basic, factual truth that no human mind can remain perfectly calm and optimized every single hour of the day. This is the first pain. It is like the dull, unpolished iron blade brought up from the valley farms, marked by the ordinary stains of working in the earth. It is a baseline condition of being a finite, living being, and no amount of intense overthinking can erase your natural vulnerability. You could not govern that first pain, because you do not hold the cosmic authority to be an unfeeling machine, nor can you eliminate the natural tides of human emotion. But the true source of your suffocating midnight static right now, the heavy, dry tightening behind your ribs, is the second pain. The second pain is the massive, jagged commentary your intellect chooses to build on top of that baseline reality. The first pain is simply an ordinary mistake was made. The second pain is the thick, abrasive slurry of self-judgment you accumulate when you scream at your own soul for being imperfect. The Buddha was not asking us to reject our growth. He was showing us how to stop adding a second wound to the first, reminding us that we cannot find a resilient inner alignment by using self-disgust as a tool to cure our hearts. Slowly, the teaching becomes personal. Think of the immense relief that comes when you realize that your chronic self-correction is an illusion of control that actually keeps your spirit raw. For years, your protective intellect has convinced you that if you just analyze your flaws with enough intensity, if you just watch your behavior with enough vigilance, you can prevent yourself from ever being judged or found wanting by the world. But when you look at the broken whetstone, you see the ultimate destination of that hyper-vigilant friction. The mind cannot find its true stability by treating itself as a broken object that must be continuously redesigned. True mindfulness is simply the wide, spacious capacity to lie flat in the dark, noticing the thick, grey slurry of your self-criticism as it moves across your chest, and allowing those gritty vibrations to exist without deciding that you must pick up your iron blades to scrape them away. When you translate these ancient insights into modern emotional language, Compassion ceases to be a rigid spiritual chore and becomes a soft, protective sanctuary for your exhausted mind. Compassion is exactly what Master Koi demonstrated when he refused to replace the broken stone and instead chose to wash the grey mud away from the young traveler's fingers. It is the strength to meet your own raw, unpolished nature without turning that awareness into a weapon of self-hatred. True inner freedom does not arrive when you finally cross the finish line of a personal growth project. It begins when you allow your mind to be exactly as unpolished and tired as it currently is, discovering that the underlying space of your consciousness does not lose its essential nobility just because it contains the marks of an ordinary day. As you allow the slow, soothing cadence of these words to pacify the hot friction behind your temples, notice how the desperate necessity to optimize your consciousness tonight begins to lose its absolute control over your body. You are the wide, dark mountain workshop that can support both the raw iron blade and the broken slate without losing its structural stillness. You are the deep limestone well that holds the weight of the mountain without demanding that the water stop its slow, natural dripping. Your spirit does not need to satisfy the competitive standards of an optimized world to deserve a deep, restorative sleep tonight. And your identity does not lose its sacred nature just because you are currently fluid and unformed. By letting the calculating engine of your self-correction rest flat on the earth, you allow the artificial momentum of your judgment to run entirely out of fuel, returning home to a heavy, unvibrating presence that requires absolutely no modification to be completely secure. In a moment, this journey will lead us down into a completely different valley, tracking the young monk as he leaves the high-altitude quarries to find a quiet lacquer artisan whose work, with a smooth river pebble, reveals a deeper way of transforming the rough edges of our lives. But before that green gorge opens its doors to your imagination, let your physical body sink fully into the slow, rhythmic cadence of this present interlude. The inhalation is a cool, mineral-rich wave that cleanses the heat from your throat. The exhalation is a heavy, wordless surrender that lets your limbs become dense and soft against the platform. You do not have to fix your mind before you are allowed to rest, and you do not have to earn your right to sleep. If it feels right, let your awareness slide gently away from the detailed chronicles of Kenji's shattered stone, bringing your attention completely back to the unmonitored sanctuary of your present room. There is absolutely no requirement for you to repair your own history in this late hour, and no invisible auditor is standing over your mattress, measuring the speed of your personal evolution. The intricate, exhausting complexities of your self-improvement projects have fully paused their movement for the evening, offering an unmeasured clearing where your tired mind is permitted to drop its heavy tools. Notice the deep, unyielding support beneath your body, where the low platform of your bed assumes the entire baseline burden of your weight without asking for a single ounce of muscular resistance or spiritual alignment. The cold, mineral-scented night air moving softly across your face carries the deep, grounding dampness of wet cedar structures and high mountain mist, slowly draining the hot, analytical static away from the tight networks behind your forehead. Take a slow, unhurried breath in, letting the cool wave expand your lower abdomen naturally, without trying to manufacture a perfect or artificially deep inhalation. As you let that breath slip softly back out into the dim space of your room, invite your tongue to drop from the roof of your mouth, allowing your lower jaw, your collarbones, and the tiny muscles around your eye sockets to go completely slack. Perhaps, if you tune your attention to the internal climate of your physical body, you might detect a specific dense tightness resting directly behind your throat, or across the center of your chest, a heavy, protective clench that feels like a hard knot of dry wood scale or a rigid ridge of overworked stone. This is the physical footprint of your chronic self-correction, the somatic weight of a system that has spent years using its own vital energy to maintain an active audit against its own natural contours. There is no need to dissolve this knot tonight, and there is no command for you to force this protective tension to vanish. Even the simple willingness to notice its presence with a soft, non-judgmental awareness is entirely enough. Now, within the quiet arena of your imagination, you might allow one specific thought of self-reproach, one recent mistake, or one sharp fear of being found fundamentally flawed to float gently into your attention. It might be the image of an ordinary conversation that leaves you feeling small, a subtle trait you have been compulsively trying to optimize, or a quiet panic that you are lagging behind the progress of your peers. Do not push this mental visitor away, and do not dive into its history to fix it, analyze it, or resolve its details. Instead, if it feels right, you might give this emotional habit a very quiet, compassionate name within your own heart, whispering softly to yourself, "Ah, there is the tired tool mender trying to scrub the slate thin again." By simply labeling the pattern without a single trace of self-punishment, you are choosing to step back from the grinding bench and sit down on the cool stone floorboards alongside the mountain spring. In the quiet workspace of your awareness, you can begin to visualize this heavy weight of self-judgment as that narrow, fine-grained grey slate whetstone resting between your palms. Feel the rough, abrasive grit of the accumulated slurry covering its face, a dark paste formed by the continuous friction of your intellect trying to grind away your natural human flaws. Every time you forced yourself to run another midnight audit of your personality, every time you scolded your spirit for being unable to achieve a pristine clarity, you were pressing the iron blades of your intellect harder against this fragile rock, wearing its center down into a dangerous, paper-thin groove. Your mind has spent years repeating this exhausting friction, believing that if you do not keep scrubbing the slate, your character will remain permanently blunt and useless. But tonight, there are no fields to plow, there are no crops to harvest, and the iron tools are allowed to lie silent on the ground. Instead of trying to maintain that desperate, grinding grip, imagine your slow, steady breathing acting exactly like a soft stream of clear, limestone-heavy, well water gently rinsing the face of the stone. With every quiet inhalation that enters your lungs, visualize a wide, protective space opening up around the raw edges of your thoughts, creating an environment where no sudden breakthrough of enlightenment is required. You are not forcing your mind to become perfectly blank, and you are not judging yourself for having felt so hypercritical for so long. You are simply allowing the natural gravity of the earth beneath you to assume the full burden of your correction. As the exhalation leaves your lips like a slow, damp breeze passing through the mountain gorge, imagine your tight fingers relaxing completely, letting the stone slurry wash away into the dark trough below. Watch what happens to the internal image when you stop treating your unpolished nature as a permanent emergency. Slowly, without any muscular effort or forced catharsis, the grey stone dust disappears, leaving the remaining slate bare, cool, and perfectly still in the shade. The deeply grooved surface does not magically flatten itself, and the broken pieces do not instantly fuse back together, but the harsh, grinding friction stops completely. The material is allowed to be exactly as thin, asymmetrical, and worn as it currently is, entirely freed from the artificial pressure of your body's weight. As your hands come to rest flat and empty by your sides, notice how the heavy, suffocating clench behind your breastbone begins to lose its hard boundaries, allowing your breath to drop effortlessly into the deep, dark spaces of your lower belly. In a moment, this path will lead us down away from the high-altitude quarries, tracking the young monk as he enters the moss-covered valley where an old lacquer artisan's smooth river pebble reveals a deeper way of meeting our imperfections. But right now, there is no requirement for your spirit to travel anywhere at all. Let this feeling of unscrubbed freedom anchor itself completely into the physical reality of your limbs. The dry, burning urgency that has kept your nervous system on high alert and your mind in a state of constant repair is losing its authority over your body, drifting slowly away from your forehead and dissolving into the spacious dark of the room. You do not have to achieve a pristine state of personal optimization to deserve a deep, restorative rest tonight. You are fully permitted to let the stone be empty, cold and completely at rest for the evening, letting the desperate need for self-correction run entirely out of momentum within the stillness of the night. The deep, cool valley air begins to rise through the hemlocks, inviting your awareness to travel down from the high-altitude stone quarries and enter a much lower, softer landscape within the forest, leaving the shattered slate whetstone and the cold mineral spring behind. The mountain path winds gently downward into a narrow, green-shadowed gorge where the rushing river slows its pace, spreading out across wide flats of dark, mossy gravel. Up on the high crags, the work was defined by raw friction, heavy iron blades, and the constant, abrasive scraping of stone against stone. But down here on the valley floor, where the ancient trees filter the grey daylight into a seamless protective canopy of jade and shadow, the environment operates under an entirely different law. It is a realm where the earth does not demand that things be violently ground down to be beautiful, but allows the natural, irregular contours of life to settle into their own silent integrity. Deep within this mossy basin, tucked against a sheer limestone wall, where wild ferns catch the constant moisture of the river mist, stands a small, low-ceilinged timber hut. This is the workshop of Sister Imi, an old lacquer artisan who has spent her long life finishing the surfaces of sacred temple bowls, cedar chests, and unplaned wooden screens. The sensory world inside her workspace is remarkably dense, slow, and grounding, saturated with the rich, warm aromas of aged cedar sap, natural pine resin, and the nutty, clean fragrance of wild perilla oil drying on unpainted timber. The only sound within the room is the slow, rhythmic sliding of a leather strop against a wooden frame, and the occasional deep sigh of the valley wind passing through the bamboo thatch. It is a sanctuary dedicated to patience, a place where the wood is not forced to lose its natural history, but is gently polished until its very flaws become a source of quiet luster. Dot! Kenji arrived at this valley workshop carrying the heavy, silent residue of his shattered confidence. Although he had left the broken slate stone on Master Koji's bench, his mind was still intensely restless, his internal watchman continuously replaying the incident, evaluating his failure, and searching for a new project of self-correction. He felt deeply exposed, convinced that because he could not maintain a pristine state of mental optimization, he was fundamentally inadequate for the spiritual life. He walked through the low doorway, his shoulders hunched under his grey wool robe, his fingers still retaining a phantom memory of the gritty stone slurry that had dried beneath his skin. He felt a desperate, urgent need to prove his worth, to find a new tool, and to immediately fix the ragged, unpolished edges of his own consciousness. Sister Emi did not offer him a direct lecture on his anxiety, and she did not ask him to explain the spiritual state of his mind. She looked at his pale, strained face and his tightly clenched jaw with a quiet, non-judgmental clarity, then gestured for him to sit cross-legged on a thick woven straw mat beside a low cedar workbench. On the table lay a raw, unpolished block of wild plumwood that had been salvaged from the riverbank, its surface incredibly rough, distorted by heavy weather, and marred by an asymmetrical cluster of deep, dark knots where the branches had broken off during a past winter storm. To Kenji's overstimulated radar, this piece of wood looked like an active emergency, its uneven texture, its rough ridges, and its dark blemishes mirrored the exact irregularities he despised within his own internal world. yielding instantly to the familiar, frantic momentum of his conditioning. Kenji's eyes immediately began to scan the workshop walls, searching for an aggressive metal scraper, a coarse iron rasp, or a new sharpening stone to forcefully plane down the wood. He believed with absolute certainty that if he did not violently shave away the ridges, if he did not erase every single blemish from the timber, the block would remain permanently ruined and unfit for the temple. His fingers twitched with the desire to fight the material, to use the sheer weight of his muscles to flatten the surface, treating the wood's natural shape as a mistake that had to be conquered before the night was through. And this is where the mind begins to soften. Sister Emmy reached into the wide sleeve of her dark indigo robe and drew out an object that surprised the young traveler. It was not a sharp knife, a metal file, or an abrasive block of stone. It was a perfectly smooth, heavy and egg-shaped black river pebble, its surface worn absolutely flawless by centuries of moving water, its dark face cool, non-reactive, and faintly gleaming with a thin coat of perilla oil. This was an ancient burnishing stone, a tool used not to cut away the fibers of the wood, but to press them down, compacting the natural grain through quiet, steady and non-destructive presence. She laid the black pebble in Kenji's palm, her old hand completely cool and steady against his trembling skin. "Look closely at the plumwood, Kenji," the old woman murmured, her voice holding the slow rhythmic weight of deep water, sliding over gravel. "You have spent your weeks believing that your spirit can only be refined through continuous, aggressive scraping, treating every ordinary knot in your character as an enemy that must be planed away through self-disgust. But look at what happens when you use a harsh blade on a piece of wood that has survived a winter storm. Because the grain around the knots is complex and twisted, an aggressive scraper will only tear the fibers deeper, creating massive, jagged wounds that ruin the heart of the timber. You cannot make the wood whole by hating its history." She took the smooth black river pebble from his hand, dipped it lightly into a small ceramic bowl of raw perilla oil, and placed it directly over one of the deep, dark knots on the plumwood block. Instead of pressing down with a grinding, destructive force, she began to move the smooth pebble across the wood in slow, wide, and rhythmic concentric circles. The sound within the loft changed completely. There was no harsh, metallic screeching, no flying dust, and no tearing of the grain. There was only a low, soothing, and leather-like sliding sound as the unyielding coldness of the riverstone met the rough ridges of the cedar. Sister Emmy was not stripping anything away from the timber, and she was not trying to force it to become a different kind of tree. She was simply sitting with the material exactly as it was, using the calm, steady weight of the pebble to burnish the surface, compressing the wild fibers until the dark knot itself began to take on a deep, mirror-like sheen. What happened next changed the way the young monk understood his own internal transformation. Sister Emmy paused, placed the smooth, black stone back into Kenji's hand, and nodded for him to continue the movement. As the young man positioned the pebble over the rough timber, the dark squall line outside finally broke over the valley, the heavy rain striking the cedar shingles with a sudden deafening roar that filled the room with a damp, cool mist. In that exact instant, Kenji's internal watchman flared up with an immediate, jittery panic. A familiar, hot wave of self-criticism rushed into his throat, his intellect screaming that he was doing it wrong, that he was moving too slowly, and that his mind was too scattered to ever achieve a true spiritual peace. His old habit told him to tighten his grip, to push the stone harder, and to use aggression to force the thoughts to vanish. But instead of obeying that old command, Kenji made one small, vital shift in how he related to his suffering. He caught himself in the transition. He stood perfectly still within his own awareness, took one long, slow breath of the perillascented air, and simply noticed the critical thoughts as they buzzed behind his eyes, refusing to treat those judgments as absolute truths. He did not magically become a perfect master of his mind, and his inner critic did not instantly disappear. He simply chose to sit directly with the uncertainty of his own uneven progress, allowing the critical voices to exist without giving them his compliance. He began to glide the smooth river pebble across the knotty wood with a slow, deliberate patience, letting the natural weight of the stone do the work. He watched the thick grey anxiety behind his forehead begin to lose its hard boundaries, and as the smooth rock compressed the rough fibers beneath his fingers, a quiet realization began to take root within his heart. He saw that the beauty of the finished wood did not come from removing the knots, but from burnishing them until they became the strongest, most luminous parts of the grain. Slowly, the teaching becomes personal, revealing that the true safety he had been searching for was never a pristine house where no mistakes were made, but the wide, open awareness that knows how to hold the unpolished elements of life with a soft and steady hand. The quiet, oil-slicked circular sliding of that smooth river pebble against the raw plumwood block now brings its deep, grounding medicine directly into the hidden chambers of your own inner landscape. As you rest here in the dark, watching the soft, unhurried rise and fall of your breathing against the midnight silence, the image of Kenji's hands resting, empty on his knees, begins to decode the exact psychological trap that has kept your own mind spinning for so long. We often believe that our profound weariness is caused entirely by our flaws, our past failures, or the difficult, unpolished circumstances of our lives. But when we strip away the external noise, we begin to see a deeper reality. The true exhaustion comes from the relentless, internal project of self-correction that your calculating intellect runs every single evening behind your closed eyes. Have you ever looked closely at why your mind is so terrified of letting its guard down? When you observe the frantic pace of your thoughts, you notice a highly sophisticated survival mechanism that operates under a single desperate assumption. If I stop criticizing myself, if I stop monitoring my flaws, I will remain permanently broken, and the world will find me out. Your intellect has turned your consciousness into a high-stakes construction site where you are simultaneously the cruel foreman and the exhausted worker, continuously checking the alignment of your personality for any sign of deviation. You spend your night hours rehearsing future conversations to ensure you perform flawlessly, or replaying past interactions to dissect where your confidence slipped, hoping that through sheer intensity of worry, you can shame yourself into a state of perfection. This constant impulse to optimize your identity is actually fear dressed up as wisdom. The mind develops a deep, agonizing resistance to uncertainty, believing that if it can just grind away your natural human irregularities, it can finally manufacture a fortress where no one can ever reject you or find you lacking. You begin to use self-judgment as a form of spiritual or personal discipline, entirely unaware that by continuously scrubbing your awareness against the stone of criticism, you are the one creating the paper-thin vulnerability that leaves you feeling so brittle. You turn your ongoing self-correction into a permanent identity, reaching a point where you no longer know who you are without your projects of self-improvement, mistaking the abrasive static of your anxiety for the true path to peace. And this is where the ancient wisdom of the Buddha cuts through the noise with a surprising, gentle clarity. Buddhist insight reminds us that we do not find our true safety by turning our minds into a hostile workshop, or by aggressively forcing our thoughts to match an idealized, flawless standard. When a wave of inadequacy or a cold sense of failure rises into your chest, your old conditioning automatically tells you to pick up your heavy iron tools to analyze the defect, to trace its history, or to launch a new campaign to fix your character. But by meeting your vulnerability with a fresh layer of frustration, You are doing exactly what Kenji did on the assembly bench. You are pressing the blade harder against an already depleted stone, ensuring that the fragile material snaps under the weight of your own judgment. To break this exhausting cycle, we must learn to see the difference between the first pain and the second pain of our human existence. The first pain is simply what life brings to your door, without asking for your permission, the factual presence of an awkward reaction, the natural arising of a difficult emotion like fear or grief, a temporary lapse in your productivity, or the basic, beautiful truth that your mind is a finite, changing entity that cannot remain perfectly aligned every single hour of the day. This is the first pain. It is like the raw plumwood block washed up on the river flats, marked by the asymmetrical knots and deep scars of a winter storm. It is a baseline condition of being a living, feeling being in an impermanent world, and no amount of late-night analysis can erase the natural history of your grain. You could not govern that first pain because you do not hold the sovereign power to be a sterile, unfeeling instrument. Nor can you eliminate the natural fluctuations of your internal weather, but the real source of your suffocating midnight static right now, the heavy, dry constriction that tightens your throat and holds your ribs in a vice, is the second pain. The second pain is the massive, jagged commentary your intellect chooses to construct on top of that baseline reality. The first pain is simply that a flaw or an error exists in this moment. The second pain is the thick, abrasive slurry of shame you generate when you tell yourself that your flaw makes you fundamentally unworthy of rest. We feed the second pain every single time we treat our natural fatigue as a personal failure, turning an ordinary necessary pause in our life into a lifelong sentence of self-reproach. Slowly, the teaching becomes a mirror for your own heart. Peace is never described in these quiet traditions as a magical state where you become a pristine, unblemished monument that never experiences a shadow of doubt or an awkward movement. True inner freedom is not the complete absence of raw edges or difficult traits. It is an entirely different relationship with those raw edges. It is the rare, spacious capacity to lie flat in the dark, noticing the gritty slurry of your self-criticism as it drifts across your awareness, and allowing those cold vibrations to exist without deciding that you must pick up your heavy tools to shave them away. It is the willingness to let the stone be worn and the wood be knotty for the evening. Discovering that the underlying presence of your consciousness does not lose its essential nobility just because it contains the natural imperfections of a human journey. When you bring your mindfulness down into this level of emotional integration, you stop treating your mind as a defective object that must be continuously redesigned. You begin to realize that the voices of insufficiency that alarm you in the dark are merely temporary weather patterns, passing through the wide dome of your awareness, like the damp river mist drifting across Sister Emmy's floorboards, and they possess absolutely no native authority to dictate your worth unless you give them your compliance. Not every critical thought that tracks your performance is an accurate statement of reality. And not every wave of self-doubt is an active command to stay awake and repair your entire soul. Your inner watchman is simply a habit of tension, a mechanical clench repeating its patterns because it has not yet been invited to empty its weight into a heavier, more supportive ground. As the slow, soothing cadence of these reflections continues to wash over the hot networks behind your forehead, notice how the urgent necessity to fix your life tonight begins to release its grip on your nervous system. You are the wide, dark valley loft that can hold both the polished river stone and the rough cedar block without losing its structural stillness. You are the ancient limestone gorge that allows the wild water to rush through its cracks without needing to alter its own path. Your spirit does not need to satisfy the competitive expectations of an optimized world to earn a deep restorative sleep tonight. and your identity does not lose its sacred nature just because you are currently unpolished and tired. By letting the calculating engine of your self-correction rest flat on the earth, you allow the artificial momentum of your judgment to run entirely out of fuel, returning home to an uncomplicated presence that requires absolutely no modification to be completely whole. The silent, oil-softened glide of that smooth river pebble against the raw plumwood block now brings its deep protective medicine directly into the immediate landscape of your modern daily life. The internal paralysis that froze the young traveler before the high stone trough is not a distant relic from an old mountain chronicle. It is the exact psychological machinery that operates beneath the surface of your most ordinary, demanding hours. We live in a world that behaves like a hyper-competitive market, constantly flashing the illusion that you must remain in a state of permanent self-optimization to survive. From the moment you open your eyes in the morning, your intellect automatically begins its daily inspection, asking if you are productive enough, if you are healing fast enough, or if you are displaying the correct amount of emotional poise. You carry your sensitive spirit through these rapid modern currents, and the moment a small irregularity appears in your day, your mind panics, picking up the heavy iron blades of judgment to violently scrub your own awareness. Now let this wisdom come closer to your own life, exploring the specific, quiet moments where the old habit of chronic self-correction attempts to hijack your present peace. Think of the sudden dry constriction that tightens across your upper chest when you are waiting for a text response and the screen remains dark. Your internal watchman immediately awakens, scanning the silence for evidence of your own social inadequacy, replaying your previous words to find the exact flaw that must have caused the delay. You lie awake at night in the blue glow of a device, checking for reassurance, scrolling through articles or reading self-help advice with an undercurrent of quiet panic, treating your own personality like a broken engine that requires an emergency manual to repair. You walk through your workplace or your neighborhood, comparing your internal confusion to the polished, edited exteriors of those around you, feeling a heavy, isolating certainty that you are uniquely behind, uniquely misaligned, or simply not enough. This defensive alertness becomes particularly cruel when your physical body is completely spent and your spirit desperately requires a period of non-doing. You want so badly to let your thoughts rest, yet a persistent underlying guilt prevents you from allowing your limbs to go heavy. The intellect whispers that taking your hands off the grinding stone is a dangerous form of negligence, convincing you that you must first earn the right to rest by completing a checklist of personal growth or resolving every single anxiety in your life. You find yourself smiling at a friend or a colleague, while a thick, abrasive slurry of self-criticism is currently building behind your breastbone, pretending to be perfectly fine because you believe that showing your raw, unpolished contours would be an absolute failure. You turn your very search for inner peace into a secondary source of friction, prosecuting your heart for still feeling anxious, as if your lingering sorrow is a proof that you are practicing incorrectly. But when we bring these modern situations into the spacious, non-reactive clearing of Buddhist clarity, we discover that true peace is never achieved by successfully manufacturing a flawless, invulnerable persona. Peace is practiced in the tiny, unpolished moments of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, when the elements of your life feel scattered and undecided. It begins when you realize with a deep, poetic certainty that not every critical thought that tracks your performance is an accurate statement of reality, and not every wave of inadequacy is an active command to stay awake and redesign your entire soul. You can care deeply about your path, your relationships, and your responsibilities without using your own sensitive nervous system as an anvil to beat your character into a different shape. Slowly, The teaching becomes personal, revealing that the internal freedom you have been looking for does not require you to arrive at a destination where no mistakes are ever made. Think of how much vital energy returns to your body when you choose to apply the discipline of the burnishing stone to your daily routine. A single, unhurried breath before you answer an intimidating email or react to an intrusive thought is a profound act of non-destructive presence. In that quiet, unmonitored gap, you are choosing to step back from the grinding bench, allowing your current experience to be exactly as uneven and knotty as it currently is, without deciding that you must bleed to flatten its grain. You are choosing to let the wet slate dust wash away into the dark basin, discovering that you can live fully within your own boundaries, without needing to hold the iron blade so tightly against your own tissue. You can act with intelligence, set beautiful boundaries, and move toward your goals with a steady heart. But you can do so without using shame as the fuel for your transformation. True mindfulness in modern life is simply the willingness to let yourself be unpolished for the evening, allowing the raw, asymmetrical realities of your day to sit undisturbed in the shade of the night. You do not have to achieve a pristine state of emotional optimization before you are permitted to sleep. And you do not have to settle every single ledger of your performance to deserve a clean, unburdened rest. The world outside will continue to spin its complex webs of expectation, but right here, inside the sanctuary of your room, the tools are allowed to lie silent on the floorboards, and the watchman is fully permitted to empty his pockets. As the slow, hypnotic cadence of these words continues to pacify the hot friction behind your temples, notice how the desperate necessity to fix your whole life tonight begins to lose its authority over your limbs. The solid ground beneath your room is completely capable of holding your entire weight without asking for a single ounce of spiritual compliance, and the deep stillness of this late hour does not demand an accounting of your emotional progress. You are not a broken instrument because you still carry the marks of a difficult storm, and you have not failed your journey because your spirit requires a slow, oiled season to soften its knots. By letting the calculating engine of your self-correction rest flat on the planks, you allow the artificial urgency of your judgment to run entirely out of momentum, returning home to an uncomplicated presence that requires absolutely no adjustment to be completely sacred. The slow, circular movement of that smooth black river pebble against the knotted plumwood now expands into an absolute, unmeasured stillness, inviting the final traces of your self-correcting urgency to dissolve completely into the dark. Outside your window, the high mountain valley has grown entirely quiet, as the lingering remnants of the rainstorm retreat far down the river canyon, leaving the green-shadowed gorge silent, cool, and perfectly undisturbed by the wind. The tall, ancient hemlocks stand motionless against the heavy granite sky, their branches no longer shaking under the weight of the gale, no longer resisting the mountain drafts, and no longer asking for any adjustment to their native form. Inside Sister Emmy's low workshop, the raw perilla oil has dried smoothly into the deep grain of the timber. The leather strops hang completely loose from their pegs, and the black burnishing stone rests silently at the bottom of its cedar chest, its non-destructive work finished for the night. The external world has withdrawn its constant scorecards, leaving you with an unmonitored baseline of privacy where no flaw needs to be audited, no behavior needs to be refined, and no progress needs to be proven to the dark. Let the profound, heavy neutrality of this late hour settle directly into the marrow of your limbs, drawing the residual static of your self-improvement projects away from your forehead and down into the dense support of your bed. Your physical frame is entirely cradled by a stable surface that asks for absolutely nothing in return for its presence, taking the full weight of your rib cage, the curve of your hips, and the back of your skull without asking for a single ounce of spiritual alignment or personal correction. Notice how your breathing has naturally discovered its own unhurried pace, flowing through your throat like a cool, liquid spring, moving through an underground limestone channel, rising without effort and falling without attachment. With each quiet exhalation that leaves your lips, the invisible armor of self-judgment simply steps out of its tracks, allowing your muscles, your throat, and the networks behind your eyes to become completely unscrubbed, soft, and heavy against the linen. Tonight, you are fully permitted to let the narrow slate sharpening stone of your intellect rest bare cold and completely undisturbed in the shade. For many years, your protective mind has convinced you that staying awake to inspect your character was your only path to safety, forcing your sensitive spirit to live like an overworked tool that can never be allowed to stop its grinding. But in this quiet dark, the workshop is entirely, and your unpolished nature is deep, whole, and completely finished with the friction of the day. You do not have to achieve a pristine state of emotional optimization to be worthy of a deep rest, and you do not have to eliminate every trace of your human flaws before you are allowed to close your eyes. The unwritten tomorrow is fully capable of arriving without your late-night corrections, and the life you have been trying to fix is held within the same vast, non-judgmental darkness that shelters your room, entirely independent of your frantic interventions. Let the soft medicine of this ancient insight sink directly into the quietest spaces of your chest, functioning exactly like that warm perilla oil absorbing deep into the complex grain around the knots of the wood. You are choosing to stop treating your natural imperfections as an active emergency that must be conquered before the dawn. You are choosing to stop the habit of treating every critical thought as an absolute statement of your worthlessness. The first pain of your human life, the ordinary mistakes you made, and the changing weather of your internal emotions cannot be undone by staying awake to scrub the slate thin, but the second pain can be laid down completely on the floorboards. You are the wide, dark valley sanctuary that remains completely immovable, whether your thoughts are calm or chaotic. You are the solid limestone gorge that knows how to hold both the rough wood and the smooth stone without losing its inner structural stillness. Allow your awareness to drift toward the final, absolute peace of the deep forest river, a quiet, slow-moving body of water that glides through the heart of the valley, where the current is perfectly cool, heavy, and unbothered by the high mountain gales. Deep within the silt at the bottom of this silent stream, completely submerged beneath the jade-collared water and the drifting river moss, rests a massive, unquarried boulder of raw grey slate. It sits flat and heavy within the riverbed, entirely unpolished, entirely uncarved, and completely undisturbed by the rapid current that rushes across its ancient shoulders. The slate carries no thin grooves from aggressive friction, no jagged edges from frantic correction, and no requirement to sharpen a single iron blade before the morning arrives. It simply belongs to the riverbed, resting in its native weight, heavy, raw, and completely at home within the spacious stillness of the deep. You do not have to solve your whole life tonight, and you do not have to apologize to the darkness for being unpolished, fluid, and undecided. The frantic projects of self-correction have run entirely out of momentum behind your closed eyes, leaving only a wide, unblemished awareness that has been breathing softly beneath your judgments all along. You are not a defective instrument because you still carry the marks of an ordinary day, and you have not failed your spiritual path because your heart requires a slow, patient interval to discover its own innate luster. The solid ground beneath you will continue to hold your weight without asking for a single ounce of your personal optimization, and the quiet clearing of this late hour requires absolutely no defense to be completely whole. And what if the beautiful, unshakable sanctuary you have been trying to build through constant self-correction was never a version of yourself you had to manufacture, but simply the quiet, unpolished presence that remains when you finally permit the stone to be empty.